Sister, we talked about supply, and the bell ringer for today was about that, which we typed in the chat. Hopefully, you had time to at least start on the cost activity, which you, of course, need to calculate the total cost by adding fixed and variable, the marginal cost by taking the current total cost minus the previous total cost, the total revenue, which is marginal revenue times units per hour, and the profit, which is total revenue minus total cost. So there's two tables there. Make sure that you do both of those before you turn it in. And for the notes today, we'll talk about supply and demand together, because the first day we talked about demand, the second day we talked about supply. And so now we'll look at both of these. And whenever we have the two together, it's known as equilibrium. And the equilibrium is the intersection of demand and supply when they are graphed. And that is the most efficient place for the price to occur, because the consumers are saving the most and the producers are making the most at that compromised position. If we're ever supplying more than we're demanding, it's known as a surplus. So the entire area in the top half of the graph in between supply and demand is known as a surplus. It means that there's too much on hand, and so prices will drop. And then the opposite is true, where demand is greater than supply, we see a shortage. And that means prices will need to rise to get to the equilibrium point. Governments can sometimes get involved and insert, for instance, a price ceiling, which means that prices can go no higher. One place that you can find this in common are urban areas where they have what is called rent control. And then the opposite is called a price floor. So an example would be the minimum wage. Now, where I have them up here on the graph is where they would create the least or no damage at all. But in reality, it doesn't make much sense, and governments won't put them in these two positions. If they decide to have rent control, what they're going to do is they're going to put it below the equilibrium because they believe the marketplace is charging people too much for rent. But when you do that, you end up with a shortage, because now there's going to be more people that will want these lower rates, and there'll be less landlords willing to supply them. And so that's one of the negative impacts of a price ceiling, is it results in a shortage. And then right now, this is where the minimum wage is. It's way lower than the equilibrium. A lot of low skill manual labor based jobs are willing to pay more than $7.25 an hour. And so the current minimum wage really isn't doing a lot of good. If it was raised to $15 an hour, it would be a little bit above the equilibrium, but notice the problem that would happen. More people would be willing to supply their labor, and less businesses would be demanding their labor. So we would end up with a surplus of labor, which is also known as unemployment. So the higher you go, the bigger the gap and the greater the amount of unemployment that will exist. But at the same time, right now, the minimum wage is useless because the equilibrium for a lot of low-skill labor is much higher than $7.25. Another thing that we can look at with both supply and demand is elasticity, the reaction of consumers to price changes. At least when we're talking about the elasticity of demand. So if the price goes up or down, what is the reaction of the people going to be? For some items, they're still going to be willing to buy it. For others, they're not. And so for elastic items, something that's flexible, it means that the people are sensitive to price change. Their demand is flexible. So for instance, donuts would be an example. If they went up, let's say you were charging 50 cents a donut and they went up to 75 cents, there's a good chance you're going to lose maybe not a majority of your customers, but a considerable amount because it's not a necessity, it's a luxury. A lot of people are going to say, I'm not going to pay 25 cents more. And so, at least for the first few weeks, they're not going to buy the donuts. Then you have a product that is the opposite of that, and that's known as inelastic. It means the demand is not flexible. And so, one example of that, of course, would be gasoline. If the price of gasoline tomorrow went up to $8 an hour, maybe those first few days, people are going to say, no, I'm not going to buy it. But if it stayed there for a couple of weeks, eventually everyone is going to have to buy it. And so their demand is inelastic. It is not flexible. Obviously, these things change over time. And if gasoline prices stayed at $6 a gallon for months, more and more people are going to move to low fuel using vehicles or electric ones. And so eventually the inelasticity fades over the long run. And then, of course, there's elasticity of supply. And that's the sensitivity of suppliers to price change. We already talked about the law of supply. If price goes up, supply goes up. If price goes down, supply goes down. But how quickly can they react to that? If the price for a barrel of oil went up by 100%, can oil producers produce a whole lot all of a sudden? And the answer is no, because it needs to be drilled and then shipped. Same thing with other types of products like apples, for instance. You need to grow the trees and wait for them to mature. So in some cases, producers can't really react. When they can react, it's known as an elastically supplied good, like bread, for instance. If you were getting $3 for a loaf of bread, but now people are willing to pay $6, bakers can certainly go out and just start making more bread. They just need the ingredients. Pretty easy. So they are extremely flexible to price changes.
Can you keep on the slide for a second?
Yep. And then, of course, there's the opposite of that. That would be inelastically supplied goods. And so those would be some of the things I mentioned. Oil, apples, for instance. It's going to take a while for producers to be able to catch up to the possible prices that they're going to receive. And so inelastically supplied goods, the suppliers will not be able to produce more or less of the product right away. Oranges are another example, for instance.
Or like just produce in general?
Yes. Some, of course, can be ready within just a month or two, but some of them take a whole season. Fruits will take the longest. And it's also true of a lot of natural resources that are harder to get, like oil. So companies in pricing have to take into account, first of all, costs. And in the exercise, it already gives you kind of an explanation, but fixed costs and variable costs are the two they have to take into consideration. They at least have to recover the fixed costs, and then on top of that, as they increase productivity, they're going to use more and more power and utilities, for instance, and so they're going to need to cover the variable costs, increasingly so over time. That would be their total costs. And adding labor is not always necessarily a good thing. At first, when you add laborers, you have what is called increasing marginal returns, which means your productivity is going up, and it's going up more and more with each additional worker. So you hire one worker, and they're making 3 units of a product per hour, and you hire a second worker, and now you're making 10 units per hour, and you hire a third worker, and then you're making 20 units per hour. So it just keeps going up more and more each time. That's increasing marginal returns. But increasing marginal returns don't last forever. Eventually, you get what are called diminishing marginal returns. So maybe you hire a fourth employee and you expect, wow, we went up 10 units the last time, maybe we'll go up 20. You do go up, but maybe you only go up to 25. So you actually did go up, but that increasing rate is diminishing. So you have diminishing marginal returns. And there might be a number of reasons why. Maybe that fourth employee doesn't have room to work as well as the other ones. Maybe because there's 4 people now, they carry on conversations and get easily distracted. Whatever the reason might be, they're increasing productivity, but not as much. And then maybe you hire a fifth worker because you think maybe this will fix it. And then your productivity goes down to 18 units per hour. So you eventually reach what we call negative marginal returns. So the more people you hire, in the long run, you will start to see a decrease in productivity. So the cost they need to take consideration when they're pricing, but they also need to take consideration their productivity. And a lot of people think a business is as successful as the people that it hires, but just because you're hiring people does not necessarily mean that you're going to end up with positive results. Yes.
Would that be true for like all businesses?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if like shops, but not like shops, but like manufacturing places. Because technically, the more people you have, that boosts productivity.
Up to a point, unless you change everything else. That's the thing. Like you have to also increase the amount of space, the amount of tools. All those other things have to be increased as well. Which
But if you just kept everything the same,
if you just kept everything the same, eventually productivity would decrease.
that's what I've been saying about working at the oil creek. We need to get new machines.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, not all businesses take these things into consideration. So for the remainder of the period, you can finish up the costs of production, or you can finish up the reading if you haven't done so already.